You're looking at the meat section. There's beef, chicken, pork, lamb. There's ground turkey. There's wild-caught salmon. There's probably some kind of fancy heritage breed something that costs 3 times more than it should. What there isn't, and what there has basically never been in any grocery store in any country in recorded human history, is lion. No wolf chops, no eagle breast, no tiger roast. That's not an accident. That's a rule so deep and so consistent across every culture on every continent that it might as well be written into the operating system of human civilization. We eat the animals that eat plants. We almost never eat the animals that eat other animals. And the reason why is one of the most layered, genuinely fascinating answers in all of food history. Let's start with the math, because the math alone is almost enough to settle this entirely. In 1942, an ecologist named Raymond Lindemann described what would eventually become known as the 10% rule. At every single step up a food chain, roughly 90% of the energy stored in that level gets lost, burned off as heat, spent on movement, used up in digestion, just gone. Only about 10% of it makes it to the next level. So a field of grass produces 100 units of energy. That supports maybe 10 units worth of deer, which supports 1 unit worth of wolf. To grow 1 pound of predator meat, you need 10 pounds of prey animal underneath it, which itself needed 100 pounds of plants underneath that. Predators are, structurally, the most expensive meat on the planet to produce. Not slightly more expensive, an order of magnitude more expensive, every single time. Think about what that actually means in practice. Raising a single beef cow to slaughter weight already requires years of grain, grazing land, and water. It's a significant investment before you ever see a return. Now imagine doing that math for a lion. You'd have to raise and slaughter 10 times the amount of prey animal just to keep one predator alive long enough to reach a useful size. No civilization in history has ever had that kind of surplus to burn on a single food source. Ancient farming communities were running on tight margins. Early agricultural societies were worried about winter. Nobody had 10 extra cows sitting around to feed to something they were hoping to eventually eat themselves. The energy arithmetic simply doesn't work, and it has never worked, not once, across any serious attempt at large-scale predator farming in any culture anywhere. But cost isn't the only problem. There's something happening inside predator meat at a chemical level that makes it genuinely dangerous in ways that have nothing to do with taste or efficiency. It's called biomagnification. Toxins in the environment, mercury, lead, industrial chemicals, persistent pesticides, they don't disappear as they move up a food chain. They accumulate. A small fish absorbs a small amount of mercury from contaminated water. A larger fish eats hundreds of those small fish and absorbs all of their mercury combined. A shark eats hundreds of those larger fish. By the time you reach the animal at the top of the chain, you are looking at a creature that has spent its entire life as a collection point for everyone else's poison. That's not a metaphor. That is the literal chemical reality of living at the apex of a food web. And this isn't a modern industrial problem. It predates chemical manufacturing by a very long time. Arctic communities had known for generations that you do not eat polar bear liver. Not because it tastes bad, but because something about it was dangerous in a way that was obvious enough to pass down as hard knowledge across centuries. Early 20th century explorers found out why the hard way. Members of Douglas Mawson's 1911 Antarctic expedition ate husky liver out of desperation. Violent headaches, skin peeling off in sheets, organ failure. The culprit turned out to be hypervitaminosis A, which is vitamin A toxicity. Carnivore livers store such extreme concentrations of vitamin A that a single meal can kill a human being. Indigenous Arctic communities had understood the danger for a very long time. Science eventually worked out the mechanism behind what those communities already knew empirically. Here's where it gets interesting, though. The toxin problem doesn't just affect the liver. It saturates the tissue throughout the whole animal in ways that compound over a lifetime of eating at the top of a chain. This is exactly why pregnant women today are advised to avoid shark, swordfish, and king mackerel. Not because those fish are inherently unhealthy in isolation, but because they've spent their lives concentrating mercury that started in microscopic algae and worked its way up through every animal they ever ate. The same accumulation process nearly drove bald eagles to extinction in the United States. DDT washed into rivers, got absorbed by algae, concentrated in small fish, concentrated harder in larger fish, concentrated harder still in the eagles that ate those fish. By the 1960s, DDT levels in apex predator tissue were high enough to soften eagle eggshells until they collapsed under the weight of the mother sitting on them. Bald eagle nesting pairs in the continental United States dropped below 1,000 before DDT was finally banned in 1972. That's what a lifetime at the top of a food chain does to a body. Then there's the texture problem, and this one doesn't get nearly enough attention. Prey animals graze, they stand in fields, they move at a moderate pace, and live, Broadly speaking, calm lives punctuated by occasional terror. Predators sprint, they stalk for hours, they fight, they wrestle struggling prey to the ground. That kind of chronic physical stress floods muscle tissue with cortisol and adrenaline, and it drains the glycogen that normally makes meat tender and mild in flavor when an animal is calm at slaughter. The result is meat that's tougher, gammier, and often carries a heavy, musky quality from testosterone related compounds that concentrate in the tissue of animals living under constant physical intensity. Hunters who have eaten mountain lion or wolf tend to describe the experience the same way: edible if you're desperate, not something you'd choose if you had literally anything else available. And the disease risk stacks directly on top of all of that. Predators eat the sick, they eat the old, they eat the injured and the weakest members of any prey population, which means they're also eating whatever parasites and pathogens those animals were carrying when they died. Trichinosis, a parasitic worm infection that was historically associated with undercooked bear and wild boar, spread precisely through predator and scavenger meat. Wildlife biologists have documented for decades that carnivore meat carries a dramatically higher parasite load than herbivore meat across virtually every species comparison you can make. A predator isn't just consuming flesh, it's consuming everything that was already wrong with its prey. Every illness, every parasite, every internal pathogen, compressed and concentrated into one animal that you are now considering as dinner. Now, the rule isn't absolute. History has real exceptions, and they're worth taking seriously because they actually reinforce the pattern rather than break it. Bear meat has been eaten in parts of Scandinavia, Russia, and North America for a very long time, but almost always in small quantities, in specific ritual contexts, and almost always cooked to a temperature that essentially sterilizes the whole thing. Lion meat occasionally appears in documented accounts from parts of sub-Saharan Africa, but almost exclusively during extreme famine conditions when every herbivore alternative had already been exhausted. In nearly every case where humans have eaten apex predator meat, it was a last resort, not a preference. Then culture caught up with biology and formalized what people had already been practicing for practical reasons. The dietary laws in Leviticus explicitly prohibit eating birds of prey and clawed carnivores, naming eagles, vultures, and hawks by species. Islamic dietary law draws the same boundary, forbidding animals that hunt with fangs or talons. Across cultures with zero historical contact, from ancient Israel to the Arabian Peninsula to indigenous traditions across the Americas and Southeast Asia, the same line kept appearing independently: eat the grazer, don't eat the hunter. That level of convergence across unconnected civilizations isn't coincidence. It's pattern recognition encoded into religious law. People noticed through generations of experience that predator meat was risky, expensive, and often made you sick, and they wrote the lesson down in the most durable format they had available. But there's another layer underneath the practical one. Predators weren't just avoided at the dinner table. They were elevated into something else entirely. The lion, the eagle, the wolf, the bear. These animals showed up across dozens of unrelated civilizations as symbols of power, kingship, divinity, and protection. They guarded temple gates. They sat on royal standards. They became the animals whose skulls were worn by chiefs and whose images were painted across the walls of sacred spaces. You don't build a religion around something and then serve it at a feast. And that framing, once it gets established across enough generations, tends to stick hard. So you end up with something interesting. The practical reasons and the cultural reasons didn't develop in conflict with each other. They developed in the same direction, reinforcing the same behavior, for entirely different reasons. The math said don't farm predators because it costs too much. The chemistry said don't eat them because the tissue is saturated with concentrated toxins. The biology of the meat said don't bother because it's tough, gamey, and full of parasites. The cultural memory said don't touch it because we've seen what happens when people try. And then religion came along and made it law. Every single pressure pointed the same way. The wolf was never a serious candidate for domestication as a food animal, not because humans never thought about it, because every time the logic got tested, the same answer came back. South Africa currently has a legal lion farming industry. It's small, it's controversial, it's been condemned by conservation organizations for years, and it exists almost entirely to sell lion bones into traditional medicine markets, not to produce meat for human consumption. The fact that the most serious modern attempt to farm an apex predator at scale is aimed at bones rather than steaks, and still generates this level of controversy and opposition, probably tells you everything you need to know about how firmly humanity has settled this particular question. 1 billion cows, 9 billion chickens a year in the United States alone. 0 meaningful lion farms anywhere producing food. The math made that decision a very long time ago, and every other layer of biology, chemistry, and culture just kept piling on in agreement.